Welcome to the fourth in our series of rare REV-inars. Today we'll be talking about the evolution of treatments for Gaucher disease and understanding the potential for gene therapy. I'm Nicola Miller, Creative Director at Rare Revolution magazine, and in the background joining me on the tech today is Becky Pender, who always does a great job, so thank you, Becky, for all the back of house bits you'll be doing. Today's session is a partnership with Prevail Therapeutics, who are committed to developing gene therapies to slow or stop the progression of neurodegenerative disease. Just a couple of housekeeping points if I can. We've got a great panel on today, so please do take advantage by asking questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can pick those up at the end. Also, if there's anything that we don't get to during today's session, we will endeavour to answer it and feed back to you afterwards. I've just popped up a little disclaimer there, so please do just take a few minutes to read that, just essentially to say that this is a discussion today for education purposes and not in terms of providing any medical advice. So if you can just take a few minutes to read that, that'd be wonderful. Today's session will also be available to revisit on demand, and we'll circulate the links to everyone that's registered in due course. I'm really thrilled to be joined by a very knowledgeable panel today. We've got co-president and co-founder of the Gaucher Community Alliance and Gaucher patient herself, Cindy Frank. Hoping to be joined shortly, I think he's running a little bit late, is Dr. Neil Weinreb, MD, who is the regional coordinator and chair of the International Collaborative Gaucher Group at the University of Miami UHealth Sylvester Cancer Center, quite a mouthful there, and Jeffrey Savigny, MD, Chief Medical Officer at Prevail Therapeutics. So hello all and welcome. Jeff, I'm going to come to you first, please, for an introduction if I can. If you could just pop your camera and mic back on there, Jeff, and then I know you're going to do a quick hello.
Yeah, hi.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and good morning and welcome everybody. My name is Jeff Savigny and I'm here on behalf of Prevail Therapeutics. And firstly, we wish to start by thanking Rare Revolution team for partnering with us in organizing venues like this. It's really venues like this that help companies like Prevail share valuable information. Secondly, I want to thank Cindy Frank for joining us. It's important to get her insights about the disease and some things that we're trying to work on to fill unmet medical needs. And also, hopefully, we'll be joined shortly by Dr. Neil Weinreb. So a little bit about myself. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Prevail Therapeutics, and I'm here to and proudly representing the passionate and dedicated research and development team at Prevail. I'm a physician scientist. I've spent most of my career in research and development and seeking innovative ways to treat people who have unmet medical needs in both rare diseases and more generic or sporadic diseases. Prevail Therapeutics is a relatively young company. It was started in 2017. Its mission is dedicated to developing gene therapies, which we'll talk a bit more about as we get into the conversation, for rare diseases, in particular ones that affect the nervous system. It's based in New York City, and we currently have over 100 people that work for us. So I look forward to having a deeper discussion with both Cindy and hopefully Dr. Weinreb. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. Great. So let's dive in, but let's go right back to the basics here. Can you just explain, Jeff, what is Gaucher disease and what are the different types? Okay,
sure. Yeah. So, Gaucher disease is a genetic disorder. People are born with it, and it's because of a because of a mutation in a gene called the GBA1 gene. So patients who have mutations can develop a spectrum of diseases that we call Gaucher disease. The most common form, and the one we'll be speaking to predominantly today, is called type 1 Gaucher disease. And this is a disease in which there's a deficiency in the enzyme glucocerebrosidase, and it leads to a swelling of several organs in the body, particularly the liver and the spleen. So they develop splenomegaly and hepatomegaly. And then these organs trap blood cells, and therefore they develop problems with platelets and anemia. So it's sort of a secondary effect of the disease. Other organs can also be affected, including the bones and lungs. It's a bit rarer, but the most common clinical manifestations are with the spleen and with the liver. That's the most common form. Much rarer forms are what we call the neuronopathic forms, and these are type 2 and type 3 Gaucher disease. And it all relates to the severity of the mutation and the amount of the enzyme that's present. And in these patients that have type 2 or type 3, they have far less enzyme and they develop neurological symptoms. The most severe is actually type 2, and these children are born with severe neurological deficits, as well as the peripheral symptoms that I mentioned earlier. And then type 3, unfortunately, the numbering is not in great order here. Type 3 is less severe than type 2. And these are people who sort of fall between type 1 and type 2, but they still have neurological symptoms. And their symptoms tend to develop a little bit later in life and to be more slowly progressive. But fundamentally, it's a problem. Starts as a problem with a gene that has a mutation that leads to an insufficient amount of an enzyme, and this leads to problems in certain organs of the body.
Brilliant, thank you, Jeff. And what does the current care pathway look like, and what are the particular challenges with that standard of care for GD1, which, is you mentioned, is the most common form?
Yeah, so there are treatments that are available, and they've been available for, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years. The standard of care treatment is something we call enzyme replacement therapy. So as I said, this gene mutation leads to a defective enzyme, and this therapy replaces the enzyme directly with an intravenous infusion. There are several products that are available that are marketed in which this enzyme is infused into the body. So this is I would say, the standard of care. It's effective for most people. It does a good job at treating the liver and the spleen. It's not so good at treating necessarily problems in the lung or in the bones. And it's totally ineffective at treating problems in the brain. And that's because it doesn't get into the brain. You give it peripherally, it has a very short half-life. So once you give it peripherally, it gets into the organs in the peripheral organs, and it does its thing, but it just cannot get into the brain. And that's why the greatest unmet need in Gaucher disease is actually for type 2 and type 3 for the neurological symptoms. So that's the current standard of care. It's effective. It's an IV infusion, and generally speaking, people have to have these IV infusions every 2 weeks, sometimes every 4 weeks, but it's a lifelong therapy. So you're really tethered to an IV for the remainder of your life.
Right, thank you so much. Yeah, so it's a really big long-term commitment for patients. And so let's bring you in then, Cindy. It's really important to think about the lived experience here. So can you talk us through, I know it's a big topic in itself, but what is it like to live with Gaucher type 1, and what are your biggest challenges?
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard. So yeah. I was diagnosed with Gaucher when I was 13, after about a year of going back to the doctor several times a week to have blood drawn and to try to figure out what was going on. So, this was back in the 1970s, when there was nothing online, and being diagnosed with a rare disease was incredibly difficult. So, good news, it's not leukemia, which was one of the original misdiagnoses, and it's Gaucher, but back then there was no treatment, and there really was no hope. And it was predicted that I would be using a wheelchair by the time I was 20, and that I wouldn't live past 30. And when I was 28, treatment became available. And I actually was in that initial trial to get the first treatment approved. And it changed everything. It changed my life. I really separate my life between pre-treatment and post-treatment, because I lead a pretty normal life now. And, I'd like to say it doesn't solve everything for me personally. Sometimes I'm a little confused when type 1 is called non-neuronopathic, because in my family, we have Lewy body dementia. I have neuropathy. So there are still a lot of things going on that the treatments available are not satisfying. But for the most part, I work and I give back to society, and I hike and exercise, and I enjoy, a pretty beautiful, normal life.
Wonderful. That must have felt quite overwhelming, being given that kind of time frame, and then approaching 28. Did you really have a sense of the sort of ticking clock, or, how did you feel about that time running up to that?
Yeah, I think it was beyond a ticking clock. I was very sick in my 20s. I was in the hospital as much as I was out of the hospital. My spleen had grown to 20 pounds. So I lived pregnant for 10, 15 years of my life. I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. If I sneezed, I got nosebleeds for 4 or 5 hours. I had to get blood transfusions when I menstruated. I mean, it was a different life. So yeah, the clock was ticking and I was incredibly sick. And I think when I had incredible amounts of bone pain and bone crises and fatigue. And it's interesting when you're that sick, on some level, you just want relief and you don't care how.
Absolutely. So what would you say are the kind of the greatest challenges for the community as a whole, and what are the kind of underappreciated or the underrepresented elements of the disease that perhaps people don't realize? I mean, you've mentioned quite a few things there, just down to, like nosebleeds and having to have a transfusion through your menstrual cycle. That's, those are quite impactful things. But what would you say are the biggest challenges for the community as a whole?
Well, and I speak as a representative of the Gaucher Community Alliance. So I co-run a patient organization. And through that, we really reach out to the patient population constantly to find out what their unmet needs are. And then we communicate them with industry and with the medical experts so that the three of us together can figure out the best ways to address these. I mean, of course, the biggest problem is that there's no available treatment that crosses the blood-brain barrier. The type 2 and 3 patients, they suffer way beyond how I suffered when I was younger. The cost of treatment is incredibly challenging. The cost of insurance and co-pays, it's hard to even find guidance on what type of insurance you should get if you have a choice, because you need to get something that's going to cover your treatment. And there is no perfect treatment. For the treatments that are available, there are still side effects. There's still symptoms that are not treated. Mental health can be a big issue, especially during COVID that got compounded. There's isolation, depression, fear. And so we feel as a patient organization, it's incredibly important to create networks and to create ways that patients can support one another, communicate with one another, and really make lifelong friends that you can live with. Someone that understands what you're going through. Testing in the community is also a challenge. We get calls all the time from people who they research, they think they might have Gaucher, and they can't get a doctor to order their test, which is incredibly surprising. And I think what's really the most underappreciated about all of this is the cost of drugs, and that cost, how it affects almost everything in our lives. Because if we don't have the funds to pay for that insurance, we're not getting treatment and we're not going to survive it.
And that's paralyzing socially as well, isn't it? And economically, because I assume that moving jobs and career progression can be really limiting if you don't want gaps in your insurance. You've got to take that's a consideration, isn't it, in terms of what you might do career wise and how you might move laterally or up in different jobs.
It has dictated every job I've ever taken in my life. Yeah. The first thing I do is I ask about that insurance policy, and I look into it and I research and I see if I'm going to be covered.
Yeah.
And also my entire life, both my husband and I have put money aside every paycheck into an account, because I know this, this disease is going to cost me a lot of money once I go on Medicare, and once if I ever want to travel, or it dictates everything.
Yeah. I think it's often the financial side is often the unseen burden that, perhaps we don't see. We're very focused on the physical and maybe even the mental health, but actually that's such a big factor, isn't it? Dr. Weinreb, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I apologize. I just could not get in eventually.
That's okay, no problem.
I joined with my own account.
Sit back and relax and settle in, and we'll get to you soon. So Jeff, if we can have a look at from a sort of scientific lens here, as the CMO, what do you see as the greatest opportunities for research and development into this disease?
Well, I think it all starts where the unmet need is, and that's why we got involved with Gaucher disease. So and the biggest unmet need is for the neurological symptoms, because kids with type 2 or type 3 have no treatment at all for their neurological symptoms. There just simply is no therapy available. Children with type 2 usually pass away within 1 to 2 years of life. So it's a real devastating disorder. And then people with type 3, the disease can be more stable, but they can have, cognitive issues, development issues. So that's where the biggest unmet need is. And in fact, that's why we started in type 2 and 3. But also point out that one of the major risk factors for Parkinson's disease is carrying one of these GBA1 gene mutations. So that's another big opportunity, and actually something that we're developing this investigational therapy for people who have GBA1 mutations in Parkinson's disease. Again, it's a neurological manifestation of the disease, and there just simply is nothing to treat their neurological symptoms. So that's another big opportunity.
And presumably the increased numbers brought about by that helps as well, because you've got more sort of a bigger cohort if you're able to look at another disease as well.
Exactly. That's an important consideration. Now, in type 1 Gaucher disease, there are also opportunities, and Cindy mentioned some of these. So, number one, while the current standard of care therapy are wonderful, and for many people, they closely come close to curing the disease, so long as they take the therapy every 2 to 4 weeks. There are some people whose symptoms do not abate with the current standard of care for whatever reason. Maybe their liver size or their spleen size doesn't come back to normal, or I'd say maybe more commonly, they still are left with problems with their bones, and they have bone crises or problems with their lungs. Current standard of care are not very good at treating those manifestations of Gaucher disease. And then, of course, it's the convenience issue. Current standard of care requires infusions, again, every 2 to 4 weeks. And I think one of the opportunities is to liberate patients from this type of treatment, and potentially provide them with a one and done approach, where it's a single infusion that could treat their disease for many years.
Thank you so much. Now, Cindy mentioned her involvement, obviously, with the patient organisation, which of course are pivotal in any kind of research and moving things forward. So what role does patient engagement play within Prevail? And have you got examples of kind of how you engage with the patient community to develop the work you're doing?
Yeah, no, patient engagement is critical to our success. Firstly, it helps us understand the unmet need. We rely on patient engagement to understand what their issues are, what patient issues are, what their families and caregivers are going through. And this is important because this is not something we can glean at medical conferences or reading papers. That's often where we get our scientific information, but that's not really there. So you really hear the emotional stories and the pain and suffering that these patients go through. So we have to rely on patient engagement to understand this. And we also learn about the experience that patients go through when we conduct clinical studies. So it's one thing to conduct a perfect clinical study to try to answer a scientific question, but it's another to run a clinical study that is patient focused or patient centric. So the study, which can be a bit onerous for patients because it requires multiple visits to follow up on many of the outcome measures, but it's important to understand what they're going through to help us make devise our protocols so it's a pleasant experience for patients. And that's the real world example. So we use patient advocacy groups to connect with patients. They give us feedback about what their needs are. And the real life example here is the biggest unmet need. And here in our clinical study, we decided to start where the biggest unmet need was, and that's in Parkinson's disease and in patients with type 2 Gaucher disease. And then secondly, we've reached out to patients and through patient advocacy groups to understand what their experiences are in participating in clinical studies. And this has had a direct influence in how we have written our protocols to try to make the experience better for the patients and the caregivers.